Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining the INSEAD Lifelong Learning webinar. I'm Yumiko Ono, and I'm an editor at the Wall Street Journal based in Singapore. It's a pleasure to be moderating this discussion today on a very timely topic, which is on the upcoming Taiwan elections and how this could be a pivotal moment for the US-China relations and for the rest of the world. First, some housekeeping rules. If you have any questions during the discussion, please put them into the Q&A box. The chat is disabled for this webinar and the camera is off for the audience. We'll have some time at the end for questions, and I've already received a lot of them in the pre-submitted version. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the website later. So now let me introduce the speakers. We have Pushan Dutt, Professor of Economics and Political Science at INSEAD. Hello, Pushan.
Hi,
and we
Yumiko.
have Josh Chin, Deputy China Bureau Chief at the Wall Street Journal, responsible for politics and general news. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Yumiko.
And we also have Alexandra Fatal, who will be our Q&A moderator. Alexandra is a venture partner at Loyal VC and an INSEAD alum, EMBA class of January 2023. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, thanks.
So, Taiwan is an island of about 23 million people. China claims it as its own. It's located about 100 miles from the southeastern coast of China, and it plays a crucial role in the global business scene because it's a producer of most of the world's advanced computer chips that everybody needs. And at a time when tensions are high between the US and China, Taiwan is gearing up for a presidential election next month. One candidate is seen to be friendlier to the US, the other two are seen to be friendlier to China, and so the rest of the world is watching closely. Today, we'll be discussing what are the potential scenarios of the elections, what will be the impact on US-China relations, and what could be the impact on businesses in Asia, Europe, and the rest of the world. So Pushan, I want to turn to you first. Could you please catch us up very quickly on who the candidates are and why we really need to be watching out for the results?
Okay, let me just share my screen.
Okay.
Okay, are my slides on?
Yes, you can see it.
So good. Very quickly, just to set some context for the discussion and the question and answers later. So if I just think about the political landscape, there are these three candidates who are running. The ruling party is the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP. The current vice president is the presidential candidate. DPP is seen as more towards pro-US. In fact, their vice presidential candidate is called the Cat Warrior, a play on the Wolf Warrior term, which has been used amongst Chinese diplomats. And facing the DPP are these other two candidates from the KMT. Traditionally, power has actually shifted between the KMT and the DPP, and then there is a smaller party supported by the youth, relatively by the youth, which is the Taiwan People Party. As Yumiko said, they have sort of different takes. KMT and TPP are sort of seen as closer towards China, seeking more integration, seeking more dialogue, more cooperation. Now, I just want to, put some context to this because, everyone is thinking, how will the elections end up? What is this going to imply for US-China relations, and what is therefore going to lead to the geopolitical tensions that we are currently facing. So just to provide some historical context, the geopolitical tensions to a large extent were triggered by the trade war started by the Trump administration. Less well-known fact is that the Biden administration has actually kept the high tariffs in place. They just do it a little bit more quietly. They don't do it over Twitter or on social media, but they do have the same high tariffs in place. In fact, they've accelerated it, and they have actually turned it into a technology war where they have imposed lots and lots of restrictions on semiconductors, exports of chips to China, and in particular, machines that actually make these chips, and even people who would work for Chinese semiconductor firms. And this is where Taiwan comes in. So Taiwan produces 1/3 of the world's computing power. And one Taiwanese firm, I'm sure many of you know, which is Taiwan Semiconductor, or TSMC, produces 90% of the world's most advanced chips. Just to give you a little bit more concrete example, everybody's talking about AI, generative AI. Now, the AI chips run on these chips from NVIDIA, and NVIDIA just designs these chips. Almost 100% of the manufacturing is actually done in Taiwan, especially in TSMC. So basically, this actually becomes, and since these export controls are at the core of the technology war, Taiwan, of course, has a very big role to play. This is a very good book written by a historian, which has just come out. If you really want to get to the nitty-gritty of the chip industry, I think this is a very, very nice place to actually start. Okay, I'm going to just spend 2 minutes talking about a small case study, okay, which has some actually good lessons. So Fujian Jinhua is or was a Taiwanese semiconductor firm, and it was sort of an integral part of China's plan to reach self-sufficiency in semiconductors. And it got something like $5.6 billion in investment. And they had a tie-up with Micron from the US, and they were working closely with Micron. Now, Micron discovers that some of the employees were actually leaving Micron, and they were quitting the firm, and they were taking insider information and intellectual property and taking it to this Fujian Jinhua. Okay, so in 2017, Micron accuses Fujian Jinhua of stealing the trade secrets. But they get countersued in turn in Chinese courts, and the Chinese courts actually find that it was actually Micron which was stealing intellectual property. Okay, so the legal mechanism simply doesn't work, and this is a tension that many firms have faced because in many cases they cannot rely on the legal channels. So here comes the Trump administration, and what they do is that they actually suddenly put this Chinese firm on a special entity list, and they ban them from buying goods with components or software or technology which is American made. Okay, this is a huge problem for the Chinese firm, and in 2019 they halt operations. So there are 3 lessons that people draw from this. Okay, the first thing is that we say semiconductors are the new oil. Okay, but this is actually not true, because that looks only at the demand side. On the supply side, for instance, there are 65,000 oil fields around the world, but there are these choke points that exist. So TSMC is an example of that. ASML from Netherlands provides all of the equipment and machines that actually make these chips. Samsung, NVIDIA makes most of the designs for most of the advanced GPUs. So there are these single choke points, okay, which allows countries to actually leverage those choke points. And this is something which the US has been doing. From China's perspective, this actually showcased their extraordinary vulnerability. They were trying to move up the value chain, okay, away from like real estate and things like that. But now, because their supply of chips and technology has been cut off, it's going to be much harder for them. And the Americans suddenly realized that they could not go through the usual WTO channels, but instead they're going to rely on national security, okay, sometimes very old legislation, and they're going to do this by executive order. And they're going to do this especially in the realm of AI, because this has huge military and intelligence uses. So in the US, the politicians don't really agree on anything, but one of the things that they seem to have united on is that China is a threat. For a long time, we thought that, if there was a lot of trade ties between countries, if there was economic interdependence, peace was natural. But now political scientists have actually started thinking that, there is a notion of weaponized interdependence, where countries can use their privileged position in these networks and supply chains to actually punish their competitors. So the stark example of this was using, after the Ukraine, when Russia invades Ukraine, the SWIFT system was used to cut off Russian banks. The same is true for, a lot of the cables and the data centers actually go through US, and now we are seeing the same in semiconductors. Now, the Europeans, on the other hand, have a little bit of a more sophisticated understanding. So they say that with China, we are going to be, cooperate on certain issues like AI ethics, climate change, etc. We're going to compete on certain industries like electric vehicles. But we are also going to systematically disagree on things like values, human rights, etc. So that's more like competitive interdependence, while the US seems to, at least stepped into weaponized interdependence. There's been a little bit of dialing back after the Apex summit and the visit by lots of US officials to China. So, but there is still a notion that China is a real threat amongst US officials and US politicians. This has actually led many people to invoke this thing which is called the Thucydides trap. Many of you might have heard about it. So he was an ancient Greek historian. So 2,400 years ago, he came up with this hypothesis that whenever a rising power meets an established power, war between the two, conflict between the two is inevitable. He was talking about Athens versus Sparta. So Sparta was the established power, Athens was the rising power. This leads to the Peloponnesian War, which Sparta ultimately wins. Later historians find that again and again you sort of see this with the rise of the Habsburgs, for instance, so the rise of the Ottomans, where the Ottomans are the rising power and the Habsburgs were the established power, or the rise of Germany, where UK and France are the established power and Germany is the rising power, the rise of the Soviet Union. So today China is the rising power and the US is sort of the established power. This, of course, worries many historians and worries all of us all that we are actually stepping into a new Cold War. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that. And it seems like what you're saying is that Taiwan, because of the chips and the chip example that you had, and because Taiwan is so dominant in the production of advanced chips, that makes it sort of important and watched by the rest of the world at a time when US and China, the tensions are higher already, and both are, or the US is trying to use it as a weaponized, as you say, tension. So, okay, Josh, I want to now go over to you. Can you get us up to speed on where things are? There's a few weeks until the elections. A lot of things have happened already until now. What happened and what kinds of things are you on the lookout for?
Right. So, yeah, it's actually been an unusually and unexpectedly eventful past couple of weeks in terms of the election. The most probably dramatic turning point happened a couple of weeks ago, or started to happen a couple of weeks ago in mid-November, when we had a surprise announcement from Ho Yo-yi, who's the presidential candidate of the KMT, the Kuomintang, which is the main opposition party, and Ko Wen-je, who's the presidential candidate for the third party, the TPP, that they were going to unite.
So the two opposition candidates are going to unite.
Right, that's correct. Yeah, so they're going to unite to take on the DPP and lie. And they announced that they were going to have an arrangement where they're going to have a panel of experts decide who would lead the ticket based on sort of recent polls and internal polling. And I mean, this was really surprising in part because the two, Ho Yo-yi and Ko Wen-je, don't really get along. They both have, I mean, as presidential candidates, they're men with large egos, and no one really expected them ever to sort of either one of them to give way to the other. But there was also the sense that if they could manage to make this work, it actually would really potentially change the landscape of the election. The current Vice President Lai, the ruling party candidate, had been leading the polls most of the way, but the other two have been running strongly, and the feeling was if they could actually pull together, they might win this thing, and that would obviously have huge implications for U.S.-China relations. But unfortunately, for the opposition party, almost immediately after this deal was announced, there was talk among political analysts about the arrangement and how it appeared to favor the KMT unexpectedly, and how Ko Wen-je, the third party candidate, had been out-negotiated. And so Ko, a few days later, basically pulled out of the agreement, or essentially didn't show up, and then came out in public and sort of admitted that he didn't trust himself to negotiate with the KMT on his own, which was a pretty stunning admission for a ostensible presidential candidate. And then roughly a week later, it all culminated when all of the opposition groups tried to salvage the deal. They got together with a last-ditch meeting right ahead of the registration deadline. They invited the press there at a hotel in Taipei. And then in front of the cameras, live streaming online, they got into a really heated argument about polling analysis. They started taking veiled swipes at each other. Until finally the KMT, the main opposition group, walked out in a huff while everyone was watching. And so that basically ended the opposition unity, very short-lived opposition unity effort. And so now, where are we? So we are, before all that happened, if you look at the sort of combined data from all the polls, in October, before all this, the DPP candidate, Lai Ching-te, had 32.4% vote polling data.
So the ruling party candidate, 32, okay.
Candidate. Yep, yep. And then Ko-en-je, who's the third party candidate, who has been popular amongst young people, had 26%, so he was in second, unexpectedly, actually. And then the KMT, the main opposition candidate, was third with 24%. Since all this happened, the second and third places have switched. So now the KMT candidate is all the way up to 29.4%. Just a little bit more than 3 percentage points behind the leader, and Ko-en-je, the third party candidate, is all the way down to 23.2%. So that's where we are. That's where the race currently stands.
So the leading candidate is still the leading candidate. That hasn't changed. But 2 and 3 have flipped, and now it's getting closer, or is it kind of clear at this point?
It's a little bit close. It's hard to tell. People disagree. I mean, depending on who you talk to, people disagree about how close the presidential election is likely to be. Most political analysts think that all of this has been really good for the ruling party candidate, and ultimately he is in the best position to win. And I think the assumption for most people is that he will win at this point, barring any sort of major upheaval of some kind. So, in terms of what could happen between now and the election, I mean, there's a few different things that could affect the race. One thing that to look out for is military activity. So in the past, China has launched exercises ahead of the elections, military exercises like around Taiwan, to try to intimidate voters. That's tended to backfire. And so, we hear from Taiwanese military sources, that they are keeping an eye out on things, but they don't actually expect China to do that because they think it would be a mistake. But there is always the possibility of an accident, some sort of accidental military encounter, a collision of some kind. There's a lot of American jets, Taiwanese jets, Chinese jets, all flying around in that area. Same thing with warships. So there is always that chance of something like that could spiral and affect the election.
Okay. And the Chinese military activity, that is for what kind of reason?
I mean, the Chinese military just periodically launches exercises in the area, and in fact they've regularly been sending warships and jets into sort of near Taiwan and the airspace and waters near Taiwan, test Taiwan's defenses. And when they're angry with something that Taiwan has done, or they're angry at U.S. overtures towards Taiwan, they'll send more planes and that sort of thing. So it's been fairly regular actually in the last year and a half, 2 years, that sort of activity. So it could step up, slightly maybe ahead of the election, but I think the expectation now anyway is that it won't get crazy. But there is always that possibility of an accident. The other thing to look out for is which is more likely, is just Chinese election interference. And there's a couple different forms this takes. One is disinformation, and this has been a big concern in Taiwan going back to the election in 2018, when you had just a huge number of sort of falsified news reports that spread widely online and that lent a lot of support to KMT, to the Kuomintang sort of pro-China or Beijing-leaning candidates in a lot of local races. So the government has been on the lookout for that sort of stuff a lot since then. I mean, Taiwan has actually amongst liberal democracies, Taiwan is the most is the one that's most subject to foreign disinformation campaigns, according to researchers at the University of Gothenburg. And so they are used to it. They've gotten actually quite sophisticated in dealing with it. In fact, you've had a bunch of European countries that sent delegations to Taiwan to study how to deal with disinformation because they're so experienced. But at the same time, you have researchers saying that China has been learning from the Russians in particular, is also getting more sophisticated. So, so that's something to look out for. And then there's also more conventional forms of pressure that China can exert. We've actually already seen this once, or in one instance, with one of the opposition candidates who we haven't mentioned yet, who's a guy named Terry Guo, who is the founder of Foxconn, which is is Apple's biggest suppliers in China. I think it's the world's largest, or one of the world's largest anyway, assemblers of iPhones. And he entered the race, and there was, I think, some concern amongst Chinese analysts that he was going to split the opposition vote. And a few weeks ago, China announced a tax investigation into Foxconn's operations in China that a lot of analysts think was basically an effort to pressure Terry Guo to drop out of the race, which he has since done. So we are seeing evidence of China already kind of getting involved in the election. And then there's also some speculation. Sorry, go ahead.
So there are a lot of things going on already. I mean, there could be stepped up military exercises. You're looking out for disinformation campaign. It's a close race. There's a lot going on.
Right. Just one other thing I'll just throw in there is some speculation that China might cancel the ECFA, the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, which is basically the free trade agreement between Taiwan and China, as a way to sort of highlight the economic pain it can impose if the DPP wins. It's hard to say how real that is, but that is a concern.
Okay, so both of you have already mentioned escalating tensions and what that might mean. Now, before we move on to the next segment of what the results could mean for U.S.-China relations, I would like to do an audience poll. So let's see now. Now, depending on the election results, Taiwan could continue to be a central flashpoint in ties between U.S. and China. So the question I would like to put to the audience is, I mean, there's no indication that war over Taiwan is imminent, but we want to take a look at some of the scenarios here. So what is most likely to be the deciding factor in whether war breaks out over Taiwan? A, domestic politics in Taiwan. B, the U.S.-China military balance. C, the state of the Chinese economy. D, the mood in Washington, D.C. Or E, none of the above. Okay, I see a lot of people voting here. Let's just, it's going a little bit up and down. So let's just give people a little bit more time. Okay, I think that's okay. So here are the results. The poll is closed now. It looks like the number one choice of the audience is the state of the Chinese economy. That could be the deciding factor in whether war breaks out over Taiwan, followed rather closely by B, the U.S.-China military balance, and things like the mood in Washington, D.C., domestic politics in Taiwan, and none of the above. There weren't as many people who thought that would be the case. So it looks like the state of the Chinese economy is the number one deciding factor according to the audience. Pushan, I'd like to put that to you. What do you make of this?
So I will bow to the wisdom of crowds. Okay. Actually, I do think that, the outcome of the election, while we are laser focused on it, is not going to move the likelihood of escalation or dampening that much. There are other factors which are far more important. So let me just sketch a few scenarios, right? So if you think about, the ruling party wins, then we essentially have the status quo, right? Yes, the Chinese are going to be a little bit annoyed, but this is not the first time this has happened. We've seen, the power shift every 8 years between the KMT and the DPP, and every time it's the same conversation. Like, what is China going to do? Is this going to lead to war? Is it going to lead to escalating tensions? Yes, there is a little bit of a shouting war and throat clearing. Okay, the thing that is, of course, very different is the fact that the tensions between the U.S. and China are very, very heightened right now. Okay, but the drivers of that and the dampening of the tensions will, I don't think, be impacted by what happens in the Taiwanese elections. So the other scenario, of course, is that the KMT wins, right? In which case we'll get more dialogue, maybe some reconciliation. So either we're going to be in the same scenario, or actually the odds of the conflict come down. But I think these are smaller events. So what's the biggest this thing was likely to actually drive the odds of military conflict? So I think the big question is, does China get back to its growth track? This is not an easy question to forecast, right? So is China going to prioritize growth, or and therefore détente between the US and China, as we saw during the APEC summit in the talks between Biden and President Xi? Are they going to continue to go along that path, tamp back on the wolf diplomacy? They have actually changed their foreign minister and things like that. So are they going to pull it back and therefore prioritize, the economic performance of China, because they can't do both of this? Or the complicating part is that, when your growth actually goes down, your incentives to actually, divert the population's interest by, identifying an external foe, that actually goes up, right? Because, you sort of just shift the attention. The other thing is their opportunity cost of going to war when your economic performance is poor is actually lower. And the third part is that, building lots of weapons and ships and, going to war is actually a fiscal boost, right? So as you can see, it does depend on the economic performance within China, and, whether Xi Jinping is going to, turn inwards or, look for an external enemy. But which way it's going to go, there are so many probabilities there.
Okay. Well, Josh, I want to turn to you now and ask you take us through how the Taiwan election results could impact the U.S.-China relations. If Pushan talked about if the ruling party wins, if there is an upset, then what could happen?
Right. So, one thing about I think Pushan is right in the sense that the election results. I mean, this conversation happens every time there's an election in Taiwan, and so the outcome of this election is not going to determine whether there's war over Taiwan at all. That being said, I think that this election is unique in the sense that it is coming at a time of extremely, as Pushan noted, extremely high tension between the US and China. And also in China, you have a leader now, Xi Jinping, who has more control, more personal control over the Chinese government than any Chinese leader in recent memory. And two, as far as according to our reporting, really does deeply personally care about Taiwan. It is the one issue that he seems to get personally animated about consistently in conversations with people who've met with him. They say that like Taiwan comes up, and that is when you really see him get sort of angry or frustrated in a way that he doesn't get when he's talking about other issues. So Taiwan really does remain the biggest potential flashpoint in relations between the U.S. and China. And like you said, there's no sense that war is imminent. We definitely don't want to give that impression, but it is important. So if you're looking at the election, I think if Lai wins, the DPP candidate, the ruling party candidate wins, Beijing feels that he is not exactly. I mean, he says he will maintain the status quo. His campaign pledge is to sort of to continue his predecessor's policy. People in Beijing do see, or the Communist Party does see Lai. They don't trust him as much. They see him as a more pro-independence politician than the current Taiwanese president Tsai Ing-wen. So they're much more nervous about him winning than they were, I think, about his predecessor winning. If the KMT wins, if there is an upset in this case, then yeah, it does reduce tensions a lot. It would not completely remove Taiwan as an issue between the U.S. and China, but it would certainly sideline it and probably open up a little bit more space for the U.S. and China to discuss other issues or the temperature. So those are the two scenarios I think we're looking at here.
Okay. Before we move on to the business impact, I want to ask you, Josh, there were some other factors perhaps within Taiwan that we should be looking at, leading up to the elections. You know, for instance, oh, the ruling party has been in power for some time now, and what do the people think about that? Also, Pushan, you mentioned the youth, but do the young people have a different sort of priorities than the older generation? Do they want something else? Is there a reason for them wanting a different candidate? Are those things the kinds of things we have to take note of, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, they've certainly made things a little bit unpredictable. And it's interesting in Taiwan when you think about the youth vote, because the DPP sort of came to power on its own youth movement, essentially, or most recently came to power on the youth movement. There was earlier a lot of anger amongst Taiwanese youth over a trade deal that the Taiwanese government planned to sign with China, that sparked what became known as the Sunflower Movement. There were protests, a huge protest movement in Taipei, and that really galvanized young people to vote for the opposition party, for the DPP. But now they've been in power for a long time, and the young people now who don't really remember the Sunflower Movement, I think, are, the sense is that they are just ready for change. To them, the DPP is the establishment. They're, and they just want something new. It's a little bit less clear exactly what they want, right? And it's, Taiwan isn't exactly like the US, where you have young people sort of tend to lean liberal, and then get more conservative as they get older, right? The Taiwan, it's a little bit less predictable. So, but their preferred candidate, Ko-Wen-je, the third party candidate, has sort of come out of this episode in November looking like he might not be the sort of person you want negotiating for your country.
Oh, this is the spat, the argument that they had in public, the other opposition.
Yeah, the argument in November, month where he came out and basically admitted that he was bad at negotiating, or that he was bad with another political party. So I think the sense for him is that he, I think a lot of people started imagining what it would be like if he was negotiating with the Communist Party, and how
I see.
That's really hurt his stock. And he was the youth candidate, if there was one. So I think that's become a little bit harder to predict.
Okay. All right. Now I want to move on to what would the election results, or how would the election results impact business, both in Asia, Europe, and the rest of the world? And Pushan, I want to turn to you next. You already mentioned how Taiwan's semiconductor prowess has, meant that it's sort of embroiled in this US versus China issue. But what do you think the election results would, or how do you think it would impact businesses in Asia?
So I think it would, again, because semiconductors are used everywhere, right? So, if you just look around wherever you're sitting, usually anything that you find man-made has a chip in it. So, therefore, I think the entire world gets impacted, right? If sort of the tensions between the US and China persist. I think we also have to step back a little bit and think about, the shocks that the businesses have experienced in the last few years. Okay, so one of the big shocks that they experienced was the COVID shock, right? And during COVID shock, supply chains broke. Okay, shipping costs rose. Logistics got snarled and things like that. So the businesses have actually experienced an event which would look, which is, of course, which pales in comparison to if there is war between the US and China, but at least they know, they have some inkling of what the impact is actually going to be. And this is, again, going to impact businesses worldwide, but especially so in this region, because a lot of these supply chains are actually within this region. So a good will cross borders, just like within Europe, multiple times before it becomes a final product and sort of shows up. So they would have experienced something like this. The second thing that they might have experienced, this is especially European businesses, was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when many of them had to make very, very difficult and quick decisions about whether they were going to pull their investments out, whether they were going to pull their people out. So many of these companies have actually spent a little bit of time thinking about the risks in their production processes, in their supply chains. What they now have to do is that now they have to actually multiply that by something like 100x to think about, what would the US and China, a conflict between US and China would entail. Now, a military conflict is less likely, but an economic blockade is more likely. But as soon as you get this
Okay.
economic blockade, the semiconductor thing gets hit very, very hard, right? So they have to now think about what will happen to semiconductors. Again, an example from COVID. If you remember, suddenly we couldn't buy cars, right? Because there was a chip shortage. Later, that gets translated into high prices and high prices of cars, eventually high prices of durable goods, and then the inflationary situation that we were all grappling with in the last 2 years. So you can see that there are lots of these interconnections that businesses have to worry about. So the big impact, I would think, would be essentially again in semiconductors.
Okay, Prashant, can you take us through a scenario of an economic blockade? How would that take place? And then, just step by step, how would this play out?
Again, lots of uncertainties. It depends on
Yes.
what's going to happen. How the different parties are going to react. So what's happening in today's world is that people are actually polishing off these old tomes of game theory that were being used during the Cold War by people like Thomas Schelling to sort of think about games of that were modeled during the Cold War. And they're using that to think about strategy. I know some big multinationals are currently doing this. So if there is an economic blockade, I mean, it will depend on it'll depend on what is the blockade on, but essentially they might let food and fuel in, but not let any goods out, in which case suddenly 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors are gone. Okay. The US has a CHIPS Act, which is supposed to is to create some resilience to that, but that's going to take about 5 to 10 years to come into place. We really don't have much this thing. So there was a recent estimate which said that something like, if there is war between US and China, that would be like a $2 trillion shock. Now, if you think about that, so that's like the other extreme scenario. Then an intermediate scenario would be the traffic on the South China Sea, which is where 60% of world trade goes through, actually gets interrupted, in which case, trade will have to be diverted, and that would be, again, like a huge trade shock for many countries. Now, the question then becomes that what happens with semiconductors? And here it is extremely controversial. In the US Congress, one of the US congressmen said that the Americans should actually blow up TSMC, okay, so that the Chinese don't get, yes, so that the Chinese don't get their hands on the technology, okay, on these advanced manufacturing capabilities. But I think that is too extreme a scenario. I think it was quickly shot down, and the Taiwanese, of course, got very angry because they are expecting support from Washington, not bombs from Washington as well. So Taiwan sees this as a silicon shield, that it's going to actually buy them protection and it's more likely that they're going to intervene. Okay. And I would also argue that even if semiconductors were not there, based on what Josh said, this is a really issue close to Xi Jinping's heart. And this is an issue which has been around for 50 years. Henry Kissinger died last week. The big thing that he's known for is, he actually went to China before Nixon went to China, right? What was the first issue that they spoke about? Taiwan. Okay. And, that's the origin of the strategic ambiguity around Taiwan. Right. And that thing was being addressed 50 years ago. This was very big for the Chinese. At that point in time, Taiwan was not a semiconductor superpower. Okay, so therefore this thing is actually very important to the Chinese.
Okay, Josh, what do you make of what will happen to the Taiwan semiconductor industry? Prashant has shared with us various scenarios and thoughts that are talked about in Washington, etc. What are you hearing about what the impact might be on the Taiwan semiconductor industry?
Well, so do you mean from a blockade or from the election?
From the election results in general.
Right. So for the election, that's much better. As a journalist, I don't deal as well in hypothetical. But yeah, for the election, it's interesting. The U.S. has been, and as Pushan has sort of alluded to this, the U.S. has been pretty aggressive on chips and on trying to secure the chip supply chain, and has instituted a lot of restrictions on China's access to the highest end chips, and it had a lot, and in that process has sort of exercised a lot of leverage over TSMC. I mean, it still allows TSMC to manufacture certain chips for China, but not the top end chips. And it can do that because the U.S. market is that much bigger, right? The most advanced tech companies and therefore the biggest customers for TSMC are all based in the U.S. The U.S. has a lot of technology that TSMC actually needs in order to make those chips. So that leverage is so strong that it might not really matter who wins the election in terms of TSMC and in terms of the chip industry, in the sense that that's not going to change. A KMT win, an opposition party win in Taiwan is not going to really change the fact that the U.S. has this leverage over TSMC. And so most likely what we're going to see is, no matter what happens, TSMC will probably make less and less of its money from China over time. And the Chinese chip industry is going to sort of keep diverging from the rest of the world and kind of maybe become its own thing. And so that's one thought. The other thing is that actually, what's interesting about this election is that Lai Ching-te, the ruling party candidate for the DPP, is actually seen as pretty business friendly, more so than Tsai Ing-wen, the current president, and he has actually placed a really high priority on chips. And so one example that my colleague Zhou Yuwang, who lives in Taiwan, raised to me recently was that actually at the launch of Chip War, the book by Chris Miller that Pushan was highlighting in Taiwan, Lai Ching-te was there, and usually with events like this, he would sort of give a quick opening speech and then leave. But in this case, he sat through the entire thing, and there's a lot of that, and a lot of other evidence suggests he really does care a lot about chips. He will be extremely supportive of the chip industry, and so from a business standpoint, there may not be actually a huge impact one way or the other. I mean, both parties are likely to sort of emphasize the health of that industry.
I see. Okay. Now, I encourage everyone in the audience to come up with questions, put them into the Q&A box. Sorry, Pushan. What are you going to say?
I make another point? So I don't think we should be all dark and gloomy. I think things are improving. So there were a series of senior official visits from Janet Yellen onwards to Jake Sullivan to and finally this culminates in the recent APEC summit. And the US and China had a pretty productive dialogue. They made the right noises. Okay, the US actually moved away from the weaponized interdependence more towards the competitive interdependence story. And President Xi said that the planet is big enough for both US and China to exist. They tamped down on the wolf warrior diplomacy, and they agreed to keep communication channels open between the two military, again, similar to what the US and the Soviet Union used to do during the Cold War. And these reconciliation moves are paying off. At least I saw one poll in China where, the share of people who see the US as an enemy has declined from a high of about 75% to slightly below 50%. So at least the trends, the movements are in the right direction.
Okay. All right. So some things might be, is there a scenario where things could improve further? And what would that mean for business?
So again, the Chinese are very upset about this technology, transactions, the restrictions.
The restrictions that the U.S. government is putting in place. Okay.
Correct. But we should not think of this as a 0-1, on-off situation. George sort of alluded to it. There are certain things, certain chips of certain capacities which they will allow exports. They will just not allow the top of the line ones. So I think, therefore, there is room to play with in terms of, relaxing how many chips, what kind of technology, even if it might not be exactly at the frontier, slightly away from the frontier, relaxing some of these export controls. Okay, and this requires goodwill on the part of both countries, and it requires giving diplomacy a chance.
Okay, Josh, do you have a positive scenario that people have been talking about with you?
Well, I mean, I think the sort of read out of APEC, out of this summit between President Biden and Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, in San Francisco last month. I think the read was that it did sort of help set a floor under the, solidify the floor under the relationship. They're communicating, as Bhushan said, the militaries have agreed to start talking again. There's been some signs of cooperation on, more cooperation on climate, which has been one of the few areas where the U.S. and China have been willing to consistently talk to each other. Also on fentanyl, potentially, which is an issue for the U.S. A lot of the precursor chemicals for fentanyl come from China, and they've been wanting to get China's help on that. So, like on the sort of low-hanging fruit, there is some sense that both sides are willing to pick that fruit and harvest it. But I mean, I just, as a journalist who was completely taken off guard by the spy balloon saga earlier this year, I'm always a little bit leery of declaring an upswing in U.S.-China relations. I feel like, right before that happened, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was supposed to be going to China
That's right.
for a meeting where we were expecting a lot of progress in the relationship, and of course, it got completely wiped out for months. So, there are signs that the U.S. and China are willing to talk and are willing to, or do see the value in stabilizing the relationship, partly because they both have their own issues to deal with. Particularly in Biden's case, the Gaza war, in China's case, the economy, Xi Jinping's case, the economy. But it's also, a recent history has shown that it doesn't take a whole lot to knock it off kilter again.
Okay, now we have some questions coming in, and we also have some pre-submitted questions. So I want to turn the floor to Alexandra. Alexandra, Q&A time for you. Take it away.
Hi. Thank you very much. Yes, we've had lots coming in. I wanted to pick up on something on Bhushan, what you were saying earlier about sort of China's calculation. So you're saying how important it is for Xi Jinping to take control of Taiwan. Could you say a bit more about that? And what are the signals that we could be looking out for that would suggest that he's actually focusing on growth?
I think that his moves towards Taiwan hinges entirely on the economic performance within China. They are worried about it. So if you were to think about what are they worried about the most, they are always worried about political instability within China the most. And if growth slows down, as the housing bubble pops, and because houses are the biggest part of the assets and the balance sheets of Chinese households, they really have to worry about that. Okay, so the Chinese economy faces sort of like a significant challenge. We talk a lot about demographics, but it's less so about demographics. The big challenge that it faces is actually pivoting away from its standard economic growth model. What is that? Which is heavy investment, infrastructure investment, export-led growth, okay? And they have to pivot away from that model because that model has run its course. So they need to pivot towards innovation. They need to pivot towards giving households a bigger share of the pie. And if they fail to do so, then countries at this stage of development fall into something which is called the middle income trap. Okay, it's a big reality where many countries get stuck there. If you think about Argentina is actually a classic example of a country which has been sitting in the middle income trap almost for 50 years now. Okay, so the Chinese policymakers are very aware of this, that they need to transition away from this, and this requires a lot of focus, a lot of effort on building institutions, providing a stable economic environment, a good investment environment, managing growth with redistribution, accelerating innovation. None of these things are easy. Okay, it's very difficult to be actually prosecuting a war while also trying to build the economy. Okay. Today, what we're also seeing is that as the growth in China is slowing down, we are seeing people and capital fleeing China. Okay, we are seeing family firms moving into Singapore. We are seeing today, New York Times had a big article about how Chinese are actually immigrating illegally into the U.S. Through Mexico. Okay, taking very, very convoluted routes, and you can see that there has been a spike in immigration into this thing. So these are things that Xi Jinping, of course, has to worry about. I understand that this is the Taiwan issue is very near and dear to him, but like all of us, he has 24 hours. Okay, like all of us, there's only so much attention that he can give to one particular problem. Okay, now this is a hope that he will prioritize the economic performance, because with better economic performance comes, better global power. One follows the other, okay, not the other way around.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And coming to you, Josh, could you say something about how you expect the upcoming US elections to impact sort of the US's strategy towards Taiwan?
Yes, first I would just like to note for the record that the Wall Street Journal had the story about Chinese people entering the US illegally months before the New York Times did.
Because subscription prices are very high.
True, but worth it, because you would have known months ago. Yeah.
I'm an economist, I would say yes.
So yeah, the US election, I mean, I actually think that is probably the most unpredictable factor here, right? Because nobody really knows at this point how it's going to turn out. I mean, the Gaza war has really, I think, changed the calculations on Biden's side, and it seems more and more likely that Trump could actually come back. And Trump is just unpredictable, right? I mean, that is his brand. There are people in his circle, or who are in his circle, in advising him on foreign policy during his presidency, who were quite hawkish on Taiwan, and we're gearing up. We're very strong advocates of defending Taiwan, of committing to defending Taiwan in the event of a U.S. invasion, doing away with strategic ambiguity. We don't know if those people will come back if Trump wins again. And if he does, we don't know if he'll listen to them, right? He's as we saw with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, Trump sometimes expresses admiration for authoritarian leaders. In fact, he's expressed admiration for Xi Jinping as a strong man. And so, would Trump want to take Xi Jinping on in the event of an invasion of Taiwan? Maybe not. And maybe Xi Jinping calculates that during a Trump presidency, the U.S. is less likely to defend Taiwan. I mean, it's just very difficult to say. And so I think the U.S. election does introduce a lot of uncertainty. I think obviously a Trump win introduces even more uncertainty. And I think that's probably the bigger factor between these two elections. That is the election that probably matters more. Although I think Pushan is right. The economy is probably the biggest factor. I would just say though that one thing that would spur Xi Jinping to act, I think, is any move by Taiwan to declare independence, or any perception on his part that the status quo was changing in a meaningful way.
And on that, so one question that came in is, how different is the so-called jobs description for Taiwan's next president compared with that of Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky? Josh, what do you?
Okay, I can. Yeah, I mean, I could try. I mean, I think it's
or whoever wants to answer that.
I'll go quickly, and then you can go, Pushan. I mean, I don't know if I have a great answer here, but I mean, I think one way to think about this is just comparing Taiwan's situation to Ukraine's, which is obviously something that a lot of people have been doing. Obviously there's two sort of smaller places that are intimidated by face conflict with larger authoritarian neighbors. The Taiwan is in a bit of a unique situation, right? In that it's unlike Ukraine, it's an island. Right, it's sort of more isolated. In some ways, it's easier to defend, but in some ways, it's easier also to isolate. The other difference is that Taiwan, unlike Ukraine, Ukraine had Crimea, right? They've been in conflict. They've had direct experience of war with Russia, but even before the invasion, right? And so you had a population that was already primed for that sort of a conflict. Taiwan, that conflict has been theoretical for decades, and they haven't had that sort of experience. And I think there are some real concerns, for among some people in Taiwan that Taiwanese people themselves are not ready to defend themselves the way that Ukrainians were. And so that is a challenge for a Taiwanese leader because, and Tsai Ing-wen, the current leader, has talked about this. There's a balance to be struck between preparing people for the potential of an invasion and not scaring them so much that you affect the economy and you affect their sense of optimism and creativity and happiness. And so I think it's a real challenge for whoever the next leader will be.
I just would like to add a couple of other things. So, yes, there are parallels, but as Josh was saying, the parallels are a little bit different. He mentioned geography. I also want to mention economics. So China is a rising power, Russia is a declining power. Okay, in recent decades, Russia has stagnated, whereas China, by some measures, is the biggest economy in the world. Huge part of global trade, huge part of global supply chains. Russia, as John McCain memorably said, is a gas station with nuclear weapons. Now, in terms of military experience, Russia has had a lot of experience, invading neighboring countries, sending the Wagner group into multiple parts of Africa. China's last conflict, I think, was in 1979 with Vietnam. Okay, but there is, I think what is very important to ask is how does China view the Ukraine conflict? And here we can only guess because they've been very opaque about it. Okay, so. But if, when the Ukraine invasion started, almost everybody thought that it would be over within a couple of weeks or so. But we've seen that Russia has actually struggled a lot. And I think most of the world has been surprised by the staying power of the US, of NATO, of the European allies, etc. So it has not been a walkover. Okay, it's actually become a stalemate between a small country and a big nuclear power. We had thought it would be an automatic walkover. So I'm pretty sure that the Chinese must be updating their priors about if there is an invasion of Taiwan. It's going to be hard to supply them because of the geographic differences. But the commitment that was shown by the European countries, by NATO, by US, etc., they must have taken that seriously into their calculations.
Okay, great, thanks. Maybe time for a really quick one. We just had we had like a couple of questions. One on sort of how Japan is looking at all of this, and also on what the impact of the elections could be on India-China relations or India-US relations.
So Japan is actually very closely observing, what is the aid and weapons which are actually going to support Ukraine? What is the staying power? Because again, militarily, Japan is not going to be a match for China, right? So and there are the same territorial disputes that over the islands that they are sort of grappling with. Okay, Japan has also faced, a few years ago, China cut off the supply of rare earth from them. As a way of punishing. So ironically, they were on the other side. They were in where the Chinese side is today, where access to semiconductors have been actually cut off. But the big thing which I would like to highlight is that all countries in the world, again, when they look at the Ukraine conflict, when the Soviet Union falls, Ukraine has nuclear weapons, okay, and it agrees to give up those nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees from the US and what is now Russia. Now, those security guarantees were violated, right? What is the key lesson that many countries are going to draw from this, whether they're in the Middle East, whether they're in the Northeast Asia, is that if you have nuclear weapons, then bigger countries are not going to invade you, okay? So and I'm scared that that your Japans and your South Koreas and going into the Middle East, your Saudi Arabias, etc. The heightened conflict both in Ukraine, Russia, and the heightening of the conflict and some of the aggressive moves by China in the region is going to actually lead to a new nuclear arms race. And that is sort of a scary scenario.
Hey, well, thank you so much for all the questions. I think that's all we have time for. We covered a lot of ground today, from the potential scenarios of the Taiwan elections to the outlook of the US elections to Ukraine, and now how Japan sees all of this, to the chip wars. So thank you so much to Pushan and Josh, the speakers, and thank you for asking the questions, Alessandra. Thank you to the audience for watching, and look out for further lifelong learning webinars. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.